We are back. It is time to dive into the waiver wire as we head into week 9. As always, we go position by position. Let's start with quarterbacks. Boone, who are we looking at this week?
So we're going to start off with Sam Darnold. He's going against the Commanders. We're going to talk about Trevor Lawrence here as well. He gets the Raiders. Aaron Rodgers versus the Colts. And then maybe we'll talk about J.J. McCarthy at the end if we have some time. But, just as a stash, not as a guy you're playing this week, just as a stash. But
really
Darnold.
Sold that. Ringing endorsement.
Just sneak him in at the end of your bench. We'll see what happens. Darnold, coming off one of his worst games of the season, so I get why people might be worried about playing him, but then he goes on bye. And the game against the Texans, I mean, that's a very tough matchup, right? So we're not really going to dock him for having a bad game there before the bye. Prior to that, he finished as a top 10 fantasy quarterback in 3 of his previous 4 outings. We were singing his praises. We were saying that this guy is playing fantastic in Clint Kubiak's system. He looks really good. I apologized already to him on the whole that I thought he was going to struggle going to Seattle. He's not struggling at all. He is certainly somebody that's in the conversation as a low-end QB1 or at worst a high-end QB2 right now for fantasy. And in weeks where there's like a bunch of buys, he is probably going to sneak into the top 12. So he's right in that range this week. Trevor Lawrence, I mean, we just talked about the Jaguars guys. Can we see both these guys be healthy? Is BTJ going to be out there? Will he have both of these top weapons? And will we finally see them like unleashed? Can Travis Hunter be the number 1 guy? Can both these guys get going in a matchup against the Raiders? I mean, maybe. Like, if you look at Lawrence, he hasn't been great for fantasy, but he's warming up, right? Top 14 fantasy quarterback in 3 straight games, top 14 in 4 of his last 6. So he's putting up okay points. He's not winning you necessarily any weeks, but he's doing all right out there as a streamer. I think you could play him. And then Aaron Rodgers, I mean, since the Steelers bye, Rodgers has been a pretty decent fantasy quarterback if you needed a fill-in. Not another guy that you probably don't need to win your week for you, but you just need somebody to get you by. QB 16, QB 7, QB 14 in his last 3. He gets the Colts this week too. Indy banged up on defense. And aside from just like they've taken advantage of Cam Ward twice now, they beat up on Geno Smith once as well. Other than that, they've given up a bunch of top 12 results in fantasy this year. QB2, QB7, QB2, QB 11. So Rodgers, I think this is another spot where he could be a bye week replacement for people out there. And then J.J. McCarthy, it's just me probably holding on to my priors before the season. But you go out, you pick him up, you see if in some of these easier matchups he can get going. We talked about how, tough matchups to start the season. The Falcons defense can sometimes show up, although they've weirdly had like a couple just absolute flops this year, and they're coming off one this week as well. They did it against the Panthers earlier in the season too, but he played against them in week 2, did not have a good result in that game. Could he, in better matchups, get going with those weapons around him if the offensive line can get healthy? Maybe, but we're looking at him more for super flex and 2 quarterback leagues, of course.
Well, these first 3 guys are in really good spots this week from a streaming perspective. Rodgers against the Colts, I think they could do a lot. I mean, Arthur Smith is Arthur Smith, but he can do some fun stuff with these tight ends against some of the linebackers there. They always, seemingly every single week, the Colts allow some speedy kind of receiver to get loose on him, whether it was Troy Franklin that one week. We saw it last week, this last game with Chamir DK ripping him up on some horizontal routes. Could that be Calvin Austin? Could it be Roman Wilson? I could see that happening in this game. Darnold, obviously, him and JSN are just going to go to work against this Washington secondary. And yeah, Trevor Lawrence, he's scrambling. So there's at least that. At least he's scrambling. There's that. There's some good streaming options here this week. I do like that. Let's get to running back, where we have some interesting names after some injuries this past week.
Yeah, always the most fun position to talk about. And it's never fun when there's injuries, and that's why these guys are getting vaulted into more opportunity. But that's the case with the first one here. Tyron Tracy Jr., somebody who I liked before the season, who we thought there was a chance that he could get going early in the year. He ended up getting hurt. Cam Scatterbo blew up. Now Cam Scatterbo's hurt, and Tracy's going to get a chance to take this job back. Dylan Sampson, he's on bye. Quinshon Judkins, he's a little bit banged up here. They're calling him day-to-day. They're going on bye, so we'll see. I think the expectation when you hear day-to-day is that he'll be ready coming out of the bye, but they also said it's an AC joint sprain, and they have no reason to tell us that he's out for weeks right now. They can just call him day-to-day, go on their bye, and then come back from the bye and reassess and maybe give more information then. So I'm picking up Dylan Sampson just in case that injury is concerning and just in case Judkins misses a little bit of time or is potentially limited coming back from the bye. Tajay Spears, we've talked about a bunch of times here. He's going up against the Chargers, which is a tough matchup, but you're not necessarily grabbing him for this matchup specifically. You're grabbing him because he's a guy that has almost like started to take over this backfield a little bit, right? Yeah. This week, broke the big play, finished with 12 touches for 82 scrimmage yards and a touchdown. He's played more than Tony Pollard, more snaps than Tony Pollard, 2 of the last 3 games here. Pollard's been a rumored trade candidate, so maybe he's a guy that gets moved and all of a sudden Spears gets more opportunity. And Spears is just somebody who's had these stretches before where he becomes like a fantasy difference maker. He did it in the fantasy playoffs last year. Could he do it down the stretch again this year if Tony Pollard gets moved or hurt or potentially just sent to the bench to get a younger guy more opportunity there? And then the last one, kind of similar to like kind of the same boat here to Tajay Spears, Isaiah Davis. He's on bye this week. Breece Hall just had that huge game. His stock has never been higher. So, hey, at least this season, maybe he could get moved coming off of this game while they're on bye. He did it against a very, very good matchup in the Bengals. I don't know that we're going to see him perform like that again, but if he gets moved, that's really why we're looking at Davis. If he gets moved, Davis steps in as the lead back in that offense. And Davis had a pretty good game himself this week, right? Like Breece Hall went off, but Davis quietly over 100 scrimmage yards in that contest. So if Hall gets dealt, if he eventually gets hurt at some point, if the opportunity arises, we could see Davis take over there. So I think those are the 4 guys, but obviously Tyron Tracy Jr. is the one that people should focus on. He's the guy that you're putting in a big bid on. He's the player that looks like he is going to be the starter as long as he stays healthy for the rest of the season. And I just wish, it's so unfortunate that it has to be when there's an injury like this to just such an exciting young player like Cam Scadaboo. And yet you look at the opportunity now for Tracy and you think about what he did last year, right? 839 rushing yards, 284 receiving yards. The vast majority of that production came after he moved into that more prominent role and took over from week 5 on. And from that point on in the season last year, he was a top 24 fantasy back. Like he has that in his bag. He could potentially give us that again with Jackson Dart out there, making that offense a little more exciting. Devin Singletary is going to be involved. Of course, people could stash him. He's not the guy you want to play here. It's going to be Tracy giving you hopefully low end RB2 numbers. At worst, I would think RB3 numbers in an offense that has a little more juice and a little more opportunity than we thought it would before the season.
I'm pretty excited about Tyron Tracy, not just because I have him stashed in a couple places, because I like to churn that bench spot. It was just, hey, let me throw a backup running back in here in case there's any injuries when I'm moving Garrett Wilson or something to IR after a given week or whatever. And unfortunately, Cam Scadaboo was the guy that got hurt. So I just luckily stumbled onto Tyron Tracy in at least a couple leagues there. So I am excited about that part, like having him on my roster. But I also think part of the reason that Scadaboo, two reasons that Scadaboo broke out, besides the fact that he's just a badass player, is one, this offensive line is playing really well with Andrew Thomas back in there. He's been a difference maker, so that's been a bit of a upgrade from a run blocking perspective. Tracy can take advantage of that as opposed to what was happening early on in the year. And 2, Jackson Dart, despite being a guy that wants to take off and run, has been willing to use the running back in the passing game. Now, I don't know what Tracy's stance is on smashing his helmet against Dart in some of these situations. But I don't know if they're quite going to be the bash bros like Dart and Scadaboo, the BFFs were, but maybe he can, smack his helmet into him a couple times and he can get some of those targets as well. So I do like Tracy going forward as a guy that could end up becoming, like you said, an every week running back too. I also wanted to point out with Tajay Spears here, you mentioned the matchup with the Chargers. It's kind of an up and down one. The run games that they have struggled with, though, are these kind of speed backs to the perimeter. Think about Ja'Cory Krosky, Merritt, some of the guys that have gotten over on this Chargers run defense. Obviously, last week, Jordan Mason is not that type of guy, which is why I think they struggled to get that run game going. 0% rushing success rate from the Vikings in that game against LA last week. But Spears is that more perimeter run-based player. So I really like him as somebody to pick up and maybe even be like a sneaky start this week if you're desperate.
And just a sneaky start in a lot of weeks, especially during buys and stuff. He can give you that production. He can break a big play. And just a guy who's shown us that he can do it for stretches before. So these guys need to be rostered more places. Like Tyron Tracy's up pretty close to that 50% rostered cutoff. He's the obvious pickup here. But when we look at these other names, like Dylan Sampson is by far the guy who would take over. And he took over in the backfield when Judkins left this game this week, right? So he could step right in. He's just 13% rostered. Spears is at 31, but we've been talking him up for weeks now. That needs to be much higher. These guys should be rostered in every league. Isaiah Davis, just 9% rostered when there's all these rumors out there that, that Breece Hall could get traded. That seems crazy to me. So let's get those numbers up, everybody. Go and pick these guys up. Find the spots on your bench. I know it's tough during bye weeks, but you got to get these guys on your benches and maybe even into your lineups, like you said about Spears.
I will just note on Breece Hall and Tony Pollard, it does kind of feel like the running back trade destinations are potentially drying up here, which is no shock. The supply is always greater than demand at running back. With DeAndre Swift and Kyle Monungai playing well in Chicago, Kimani Vidal looking like he can hold it down in LA for the Chargers. I am struggling to see like obvious landing spots for these backs, so there is a chance that just Pollard remains with the Titans and Breece Hall remains with the Jets. I just wanted to note that as we're talking these running back pickup options.
I'm just worried, and I don't want to say this, but I feel the need to, that we're recording this before the Monday Nighter and that the Chiefs play tonight. So hope there is not any injuries in that game. Hope everybody performs well, but that could be a destination. I would love to see a guy like Breece Hall end up in that offense. Not as a Bills fan, but as a fantasy manager and a fantasy analyst, I would love to see Breece Hall get in an offense like that.
You'll get Kareem Hunt and you will like it. All right. How about that, pal? All right. We're going to take one last quick break. When we come back, we'll talk through wide receivers, tight ends, and a deep sleeper off the waiver wire right after this. All right. We're back. We're continuing to look at waiver wire options heading into week 9 of the NFL season. Boone, let's get into wide receivers.
Yeah, all these guys are kind of in a very similar range. So if people want to shuffle them up and have them a different way, that's fine. I'm not going to put up too much argument. The way I have them right now is Kayshon Boutte versus the Falcons, Trey Tucker versus the Jags, Troy Franklin at the Texans, and then Shamiri DK at the Chargers versus the Chargers. He's at home in that one. And we can go through them a little bit. Their names, a lot of these guys that we've already talked about on the show before that I've written up in my waiver wire column. Kayshon Boutte, he's just become like a really solid player in this Patriots offense, right? He's kind of on a hot streak right now. Stat lines the last 3 weeks: 5 for 93 and 2 touchdowns, 2 for 55 and a touchdown, 3 for 75 in a touchdown. You'd be very happy if you had him in your lineup for those 3 games. He's not cleared 100 yards. He's not cleared 100 yards or a touchdown. No, he has cleared 100 yards or a touchdown in 5 of his 8 appearances week 1 this season. Yeah, sometimes you get those stats backwards when you write them down. Drake May is just playing at an extremely high level, and Boutte's kind of going along for the ride here, and he's getting a ton of volume. He's running the most routes in that offense, so he certainly warrants consideration. I have him in the wide receiver 3 flex range. You look at Trey Tucker, I mean, he's been like a real, boom or bust guy for fantasy in the past. This year, he's still doing it, but the booms are way bigger, right? At least 70 scrimmage yards in 4 of his first 7 games here, 33 yards or less in the other 3. So you're either getting that great performance from him or you're going to be very unhappy he's in your lineup, but that's okay if you're putting him in your flex spot, right? You want to see a guy that can go out and have a monster game like he did when he had 3 touchdowns a month ago or so. And coming off his bye, he gets favorable matchups here against the Jags in week 9, the Cowboys in week 11. That's 2 of his next 3. There's also the looming possibility that Jacoby Myers could get traded before the deadline. So much buzz on that out there. I feel like if anybody gets dealt, this one makes a lot of sense. They just signed veteran Tyler Lockett there. Is that just a precursor to trading away Jacoby Myers? Maybe.
Yes.
And I don't think Lockett being there would be that much of a concern. I don't think he has that much left in the tank, unfortunately. So if Jacoby Myers gets traded, I think Tucker's fantasy outlook would get a bump as well on top of what he's already done this season. So he's in that wide receiver 4 flex range with Jacoby Myers there. If Myers gets traded, then we're talking about him potentially as a wide receiver 3 the rest of the way. Troy Franklin popped up for another really big game this week, 6 catches for 89 yards, 2 touchdowns in that one. It's worth noting that the playing time is only seen like a slight uptick though in recent weeks. You kind of wish that he would become a full-time player. That's just not happening, but he has garnered 18 targets over the last 2 outings here. He's found the end zone 3 times during that span. he's also benefited from a pretty easy schedule in those games, and now it's going to be a much tougher contest against the Texans in week 9. So keep all of that in mind. That's why I might not have him at the top of this list. I'm guessing some other waiver wire articles out there might, because of that big game that he just had. But he's a guy that you could look to and play. Just know, like the other guys that I'm mentioning, there's kind of that boom bust element to him. So he's a wide receiver for flex play, but a guy who has a much higher ceiling when he does come through for you. And then Chimere DK, the Titans rookies, like, they've been pretty productive. These receivers are coming through. You factor in these are day 3 guys. I think it's pretty impressive what they've been doing, right? And Alec Ayomanor, he earned the role earlier in the season. His numbers have been like kind of level all year long, but he hasn't topped 60 yards in a game. So he's not showing that true ceiling, where DK, he has, right? With Calvin Ridley missing some time recently, we see DK go out there, 4 catches for 70 yards and a touchdown in week 7, 7 grabs for 93 yards over the weekend. We don't know for sure how this is all going to shake out if Calvin Ridley comes back and when Calvin Ridley comes back. But I think if you're looking to invest in one of these rookies, and if you're looking to invest probably fairly cheap into this offense, DK would be the guy to go with, although investing in the Titans offense might not be the way to win yourself a fantasy championship. But if you need one of those like bye week fill-ins, you need a guy to step in as a flex for you, I think DK would be the one in that offense that I would go after.
I think DK's clearly impressed me more the last couple weeks than Ayomanor has this year. And like Tyler Lockett being released freed up DK to be that speed slot receiver for this team. Yeah. So I like him definitely the best out of that receiving, the rookies there rest of season. Kayshon Boutte, man, 3 or fewer catches in 6 games this year, but it hasn't mattered because Drake May and him are white hot in terms of the downfield passes. He has 8 targets the last 2 games, and he's averaging over 20 air yards, and he's converting on so many of those. It's just outrageous stuff from Kayshon Boutte. At some point, he's going to have a floor game with catching that few passes every single week, but there's not – I just looked at it. There's not a red flag matchup here in the next few weeks. Like last week kind of was, and he still came through. So you can he should be 40% rostered. That should be way higher. And I'll just disagree a little bit about Troy Franklin. He's at least on the field 77% of the routes, which is good enough. Like it's unprecedented for a second receiver. But I definitely think he's the shakiest bet here. Not the shakiest bet because DK plays in a worse offense and so does Trey Tucker, but I still would like to see some more Pat Bryant there. So tough matchup for him as well in Houston this week. Let's go to tight ends where we have some more interesting names to discuss.
Yeah, I went with a shorter list here this week just because you can go check out my column if you want to look for deeper tight ends. But once you get past these 3 guys, all the guys are kind of the same. You're taking shots, you're taking risk with all of them. But the top 3 are all players that I think people should go out and get who could potentially be top 12, top 15 fantasy tight ends the rest of the way. First one's Harold Fannin Jr., but he's on bye this week. The second one is Mason Taylor, but he's on bye this week. And the third one is Juwan Johnson at the Rams. And I mean, looking at Fannin, we've talked about him a bunch of times on the show, and he's right up there close to that 50% rostered mark. So he might already be taken in your league out there, but 62 yards and a touchdown over the weekend. He did get a little banged up in that game, so that's another one that we're going to have to monitor. And he's going on bye, so you can't use him this week, but a guy that genuinely could be a tight end 1 the rest of the way for fantasy. And his teammate, this is another situation. We talked about some of the running backs that you could pick up and stash and might have more value if the starter ahead of them gets traded. Well, we're already seeing Fannin give some value playing alongside David Njoku. What happens if David Njoku gets traded? And he's also been rumored to potentially get moved. So he's a name to consider there. Mason Taylor, 5 for 34 and a touchdown this weekend, but being on bye, he might get dropped or he might be still available. You could get him. He's at worst going to be the number 2 target in that offense. And then Juwan Johnson's the interesting one. 28 targets, 19 catches, 176 yards and a touchdown over those first 3 games. Then the numbers just fell off for 3 or 4 weeks. It was because he was hurt. He was dealing with injuries. Now he's healthy. He's getting back to that early season production. 10 receptions, 132 yards over his last 2 outings. There's talk like we had earlier that Rashid Shaheed could get moved in a deal. So regardless, I think you're looking at Johnson as somebody that can be that strong bye week fill-in, maybe even sneak into the low end tight end 1 conversation.
I like it. Yeah, I totally agree. He can definitely kind of hang out in that range going forward. All right, give us one deep sleeper as we head into week 9.
Another guy on bye. I don't know why everybody's on bye that I'm telling you to pick up this week, but I think it's because the mindset should be the rest of the season, making a push for the fantasy playoffs. That's where a lot of my teams are. That's what I'm thinking about right now. Tank Bigsby is the guy that I want to bring up. And there's been a lot of changes in that Eagles backfield behind Saquon Barkley going into the season. We thought it was going to be Will Shipley. He got hurt. A.J. Dillon got an opportunity. Then he took a back seat. Shipley's back from the injury, but Tank Bigsby is the guy that made it pretty clear this weekend. He is the backup to roster there. He got the most volume behind Saquon Barkley, and Saquon Barkley suffered a groin injury. So they're going on the bye. We'll see coming out of the bye. They're saying it's minor, but if Saquon isn't 100% coming out of the bye, Tank Bigsby is the one to roster behind him in that backfield.
I love it. Yeah, he looked pretty explosive this past game against the Giants. First time we've really seen a flash from him in the Eagles uniform. So that's Justin Boone's waiver wire pickups heading into week 9. Remember, folks, we are reading again. Boone, the people are I've been getting people saying it back to me, so this is good. The people know they're supposed to be reading again in 2025, so they can check out your waiver column on the website if they need some more options to pick up. Shout out to Boone, a packed episode here on the People's Panic Meter. Again, I think we're really helping each other out here, Boone, this season. We're keeping each other level-headed, I think.
Absolutely, as we should. It's what good teammates do.